Let's talk about the biggest and baddest brain bug of the lot, with a look at the Neurotyrant in 10th edition 40k and the new Tyranids Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a focused unit review of the Neurotyrant and talk about the value that it brings for the table for the points. In the video we'll talk briefly about the model, go over its datasheet and all its special rules, any obvious buffs and synergies from the new Tyranids detachments in the Codex, and how I think about using one in-game. The Neurotyrant is a pretty snazzy new Tyranid model in my opinion. It was initially released in the Leviathan box, likely to get a secondary release somewhere down the line, probably with sprues out of that same box, though at the moment Games Workshop seems to be leaving it in limbo. The main way to get your hands on it literally just from the Leviathan box and people who might be selling it on second hand. Hopefully it won't be too long before they make individual sprues available. In the lore, basically this guy is a Zoanthrope Hive Tyrant, a focusing node for the Tyranid Shadow in the Warp, making enemy psychers and forces struggle immensely in its presence, and it basically does all the same things that a regular Hive Tyrant would do, a command and control node for lesser Tyranid organisms nearby, but trades out the more traditional bioweapons of the Hive Tyrants with just focus on massive neurological might. It uses its psychic powers to float its way into battle and blast the enemy with powerful psychic attacks. They're accompanied into battle with their little attendant Neuroloids, which are really quite cute little dancing brain things. And just in general, the model was very well received in the Leviathan box. In a vote that I did about people's favourite models from that box, it was voted the very most popular miniature. It's got some cool harking back to the old Tyranid Zoanthrope from ages past, plus it's just quite cool to represent the sheer eldritch horror of the Tyranids. It's definitely got some Cthulhu vibes going on. In-game, the Neurotyrant remains a fairly cheap mini-monster for the Tyranids, 105 points, so not really very comparable with the other Hive Tyrants, though admittedly it's definitely far from them in terms of both damage and defense. I think Neurotyrants are kind of an interesting prospect to add to an army, as for those 105 points you're kind of getting 3 different things rolled into one. A fairly cheap monster that doesn't have too bad durability with a Psychic Torrent attack to raise some enemy infantry. A big boost to the Shadow in the Warp, debuffing it by -1, which is really quite significant that we'll get onto later, and also just generally helping Synapse for the Psychic Swarm. Those Neuroloids can now go out to 18 inches in the new Codex, which is quite a nice increase. Durability wise, for 105 points, I'd argue it's not awful. It's got Toughness 8, 9 wounds, and a 4+ invulnerable save. And I feel like it's kind of in an interesting middle ground. It's actually reasonably tanky against high power anti-tank weapons for the cost due to that invul. Things like las cannons that might have forced other monsters to save on a 5+ or a 6 will be contending with a 4+, and it is still really quite resilient to small arms with bolters and things wounding it on a 6. If the enemy does have any major medium strength firepower though, then that's going to go through it very quickly indeed. Things like autocannons basically seem like the ideal thing to take this down. It doesn't really have a good save, so the AP doesn't really matter that much, and you still might be wounding it on 3s. I'd say it's good enough that the durability isn't enough to be a major weakness just on its own though. For its damage output, the Neurotyrant attacks with the Psychic Scream, 2d6 shots within 18 inches, auto-hitting at Strength 5, AP 1, Damage 2 and ignoring cover. It may only be heavy bolter style hits, but it's rather a lot of them, and ignoring cover is really quite good. With average rolling you're getting around about 7 hits there, though obviously can be very swingy. And with that kind of profile, its ideal prey is going to be things like standard Space Marines, where it kills around about 2 or 3 intercessors per volley of fire. Can take chunks out of hordes like termagants, killing 4 of them, though it only averages around about 1 failed save against, say, Space Marine Terminators, which isn't really all that exciting. Definitely not awful for damage output, though a little bit matchup dependent, I'd say. Having reasonably big chunky flamer attacks is pretty nice for Overwatch as well. If the opponent's running up with some very fragile damage dealers, you could kill most of a squad of those potentially. And it could be quite nice to park nearby to an objective where it can see that an Overwatch thing is moving up to take it. That would be pretty reasonable. In melee it doesn't really do much, just 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Could kill maybe a couple of horde infantry models, but I definitely wouldn't be trusting it to take out anything more than that. The Neurotyrant does have the option of leading some units. You can either have it join a squad of Tyrant Guard or a unit of Neurogaunts, which have the additional advantage of putting out its Synapse range a little bit further. And it does have a leader buff type special rule. You add +1 to the hit roll of the unit that you're leading, and +1 to the wound roll if the target happens to be battle shocked as well, which is kind of helpful, but the Neurotyrant doesn't actually have any way of triggering battle shock tests, bar the Shadow in the Warp thing that only happens once per game. I feel like the first instincts of most people when they first see the unit would be that he'd be probably quite good with Neurogaunts and actually keep him a little bit safer. But in general, for the most part in competitive lists that the Neurotyrant's been run, I don't generally tend to see people running him in any sort of guard at all, preferring instead to go off solo. I don't necessarily think that giving him a bodyguard is definitely a terrible idea. Both units are at least fairly cheap and they both have advantages, but they maybe just don't seem super necessary, as he's perhaps not as vital to protect as say something like a Hive Tyrant for example. As mentioned, I'd argue that his toughness for the cost isn't awful. A lot of his value just comes from the Shadow in the Warp thing, which can happen early in the game potentially, and from there he's basically a unit that can be fairly happy sacrificing itself on the front line. Maybe not quite as pivotal to keep alive compared with the Hive Tyrant that's giving you free stratagems all game long. For the two options, Neurogaunts are just 45 points for 11 wounds, which is pretty good in terms of points per wound there. It does mean that he would have quite a lot of ablative wounds to just stop a few big anti-tank weapons from dealing with him, and could make him a slightly annoying model to take down. Maybe the biggest issue with Neurogaunts though comes with the fact that they will temporarily reduce his toughness to 3, which means say for example if the opponent had whittled down the Neurogaunts with a few rounds of shooting, there were only say 3 of them left plus the Neurotyrant, and then they shot the unit with really quite a big unit with say 20 shots, all at strength 4 and wounding on 3s, you do all of those wound rolls based on the Neurogaunt's toughness, and then a whole bunch of those saves would then have to be taken on the Neurotyrant after the last few Neurogaunts fall. So essentially the Neurogaunts might well just gift the enemy a way to get a whole bunch of wounds on the Neurotyrant with small arms that they might not otherwise be able to do. Basically, until the last couple of Neurogaunts fall, the enemy will be wounding with all their weapons against the unit based on the toughness 3 profile, which means that the Neurotyrant might be taking a whole bunch of wounds that it wouldn't have done otherwise. If it's still alive after the last of the Neurogaunts fall though, it will revert back to its toughness 8, but by then it might have taken a fair bit of damage. Still though, Neurogaunts definitely aren't terrible in toughness for the cost, you do get a lot of wounds for 45 points even if they don't do much else besides extend the synapse web. The other option is Tyrant Guard, which are 95 points for 3 of them, or 190 for 6. These guys are way tougher, with toughness 8 and a 3 plus save, and they do actually have a little bit of combat threat, which could genuinely be helped out by the +1 to hit from the Neurotyrant, though I still don't think it's probably quite enough to make them into a standout good melee unit overall. I maybe don't think that they're terrible as a combined offering, does mean that the Neurotyrant Psyflame can be a bit safer, and they could bully some light to medium infantry units, but I'd definitely weigh them up against taking out another primary damage dealer for the Tyranids elsewhere, and you could almost have a second Neurotyrant for that kind of cost if you just wanted redundancy, not that I think that that's a particularly good idea. Otherwise, for its buff and debuff powers, the Neurotyrant has its Synapse extension thing. In the command phase, you can select 2 Tyranids units within 18 inches of that, and then put the Neuroloid tokens by them, and from then on they count as being in Synapse range until the start of your next command phase. That can be helpful for some detachment and stratagem type things, and just really quite good for making far-flung Tyranids units not fail leadership quite so much. I feel like the extension to 18 inches does make it significantly better, and you can have Tyranids ranging quite far away and still count as being in Synapse. Sometimes it could be quite big if it saves a unit from failing a key battle shock test and stopping them from losing an objective. A lot of the time though it might not be all that impactful. I feel like it's just a nice little extra nice to have sat in the middle of the army, and definitely contributes towards the Neurotyrant's overall value. Perhaps the more exciting part, though, is the big debuff to the Tyranid's core mechanic, the Shadow in the Warp, that the Neurotyrant gets. Kind of interesting just to have this present on a single model within the army. It means that when you trigger the Shadow in the Warp once per game, then when the enemies come to take their battle shock test that they need to take with that, they all get a -1 to the test if there happens to be at least one Neurotyrant somewhere on the board. It's only a 1-turn thing, but I do think that that's really quite a serious debuff, and you are going to add up to a bunch more enemy units failing from that, at least with average rolling. Typically in 40k, leadership is usually either on a 6+ or a 7+. A leadership 6 would go to a leadership 7, so increase from a 27% chance to fail to a 42% chance to fail, and then a leadership 7+ would go from a 42% chance to fail to a 58% chance to fail. Means that leadership 7 armies would generally have greater than 50% of their units failing across the board, which does seem kind of intimidating. The effect of this might be a little bit more important if there's more enemy units on the board and more enemies to fail the battle shock. Say for example, if the enemy had 15 different units on the board at one time, rough napkin math would generally say that you'd expect around about 3 more enemy units to fail compared with what they would have done otherwise, I feel like that could be enough to be pretty impactful and give them problems either falling back, holding objectives, or using stratagems. It can definitely just be a little bit scattergun though, depending on exactly what decides to fail. You might get lucky and all the opponent's most important units might, or you might get unlucky and it be relatively unimportant things that can handle being battle shocked for a turn. I feel like buffing the shadow is maybe one of the more reliable leadership manipulation things that Tyranids can do. You can't technically use Insane Bravery against it, I believe, due to it happening earlier in the command phase, and Insane Bravery specifying that it has to be used in the Battle Shock section of the command phase, so you can't use it to ward it off. And I guess in theory the value of having a Neurotyrant on the board might be upped if you have other leadership bugs on the board. In particular, making a bunch of things battle shocked could be excellent if you've got some Neurolictors about. If the enemy fails battle shock and they're around to capitalise, you could make them +1 to wound for the rest of your Tyranid army, which is pretty big. Overall, I'd say that this shadow debuff is fairly significant, even if it's just for a few units just for one turn. I would generally see this as being worth a good few points off the Neurolictor's value on itself. If, say, you said in your head you were paying 20 points for this, an extra 5 points for the Synapse thing, and you're basically left with a monster with okay damage and defense and fairly good psychic flame shooting. I feel like between the three, you could justify a Neurotyrant in quite a lot of armies, even if it's maybe something that isn't strictly necessary to every Tyranid force out there. Otherwise though, beyond that, for other buffs and synergies that the Neurotyrant can have, it is just a Synapse creature in its own right, so it'll help out with things within 6 inches. It does have its own objective control, and is rarely going to be failing Battle Shock itself as well, testing on 3d6, that's all well and good as well. We've already mentioned Neurolictors, Neurogaunts and Tyrant Guard. I suppose it could get some value out of other Tyranid durability buffing units as well. Things like Venanthropes and the Psychophage could make it a little bit tougher if they're in the battle line alongside it. Otherwise, for core stratagems, Overwatch does seem like perhaps the best one to be thinking about for this guy. 1 CP to maybe kill something like 2 or 3 Space Marines on average is pretty reasonable in terms of value return, particularly if those Space Marines moving in front of it were just about to open up with some scary firepower and kill some bugs of themselves. In the new Tyranids Codex, there's plenty of interesting things from the new detachments that the Neurotyrant can be taken in, and I feel like there's one that just really helps it out every which way basically. I think if you're running Synaptic Nexus Tyranids, then the Neurotyrant is probably borderline auto-include. Just starting out, there's a 10-point enhancement that makes the Flamer attack go from moderately threatening to really quite seriously threatening. You basically get an extra pip of strength and an extra pip of AP for 10 points more. That turns the Neurotyrant Flamer into 2d6 auto hits at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. You're now fairly reliably killing around about 3 Marines, 1 Space Marine Terminator, or around 6 Termagants. Against the right targets, it's really quite a significant increase. On top of that, that detachment's all about Synapse, and having more units within Synapse range will help out. It does have its own 6-inch aura, and you could also use it as a focus for Irresistible Will. Use the Neurotyrant to mark an enemy unit for big rerolls to hit and wound. That could be really quite nice alongside a choir of Zoanthropes, for example, or shooting down against one target. Finally, its Battle Shock things could help out with Smothering Shadow. If more units fail Shadow in the Warp, then you might have a bit more scope for using that one. 1 command points to hand out a bunch of mortal wounds to somebody else within Synapse range. I think the Neurotyrant is definitely one to consider in that little setup. In the rest it's kind of fine though, even if they might not do loads for it. It'll basically just do what it does as an add-on to the army that doesn't really take too much away from the core strategy. The invasion fleet's maybe a bit unfortunate in that it can't really use its various damage buffs as its weapon auto hits. I guess it could use the Feel No Pain stratagem, but I think there might be better targets for that. The Crusher Stampede might rarely give you a +1 to wound if the Neurotyrant's very badly injured but not killed. That could be kind of fun. And there are some stratagems to support monsters, though again maybe might be better used on other things. I feel like perhaps the Unending Swarm could be interesting to put one in a big unit of Neurogaunts. That might have some positives and negatives, but it does seem quite a nice way of putting a big scary threat in an Endless Multitudes unit. That's still really quite a lot of wounds with a great big Psychic Flamer type threat, all for less than 200 points. Overall, my current take would be is that the Neurotyrant does seem to be in a pretty reasonable place for Codex Tyranids. Quite a good price point for the big alpha brain bug. I feel like just adding one into an army is rarely going to be a bad decision, though I don't think I'd take more than one due to the diminishing returns of you already having the debuff on Shadow in the Warp. My game plan would generally be to try and keep it at least fairly safe until the Shadow debuff goes off. Ideally somewhere around turn 2 I think would usually be a good idea for that, and particularly if the opponent's got an objective they might lose by triggering it in their turn. From there, I'd move up to being Overwatch range of midfield objectives, depending on how relevant that's going to be against the enemy army, and just be at least a fairly expendable monster that can provide some synapse to units ranging ahead of you. If it takes some big chunks out of enemy infantry with its Psychic Scream, then all well and good. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Neurotyrant. How convinced are you by this guy in the Tyranids Codex at the moment, and would you be tempted to use one in game yourself? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure I'll have plenty more for the Tyranids. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way in which I can keep all these videos coming quite so often. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.